So the fact that we're talking about the state CCR.
Yes.
Leads us to what the state CCR did.
With IRAD. So this is different than a lethality assessment. There are a lot of national lethality assessments that are used to try to predict whether a victim of domestic violence will be killed by their partner. This one is called a risk of dangerousness, meaning that there's increased risk for the victim to be assaulted, increased risk of danger, but it also includes some lethality factors, which makes it different from a lethality assessment. So this was created in efforts to try to flag those cases, because what we were hearing was law enforcement officers would go out on the scene of a domestic, feel like they weren't, like we said earlier, they get a 10-minute picture of somebody's 20-year life and trying to figure out which cases needed more resources, were at risk for a potential higher risk of danger, and we didn't have a real good tool for them to be able to use. So this assessment was created for use by law enforcement officers who are responding on the scene, by patrol officers. So understanding that they're going to be limited in their time, they're going to be limited in their resources, to be able to fill out while they were on the scene of a domestic, and be able to fill it out and figure out what to do from filling out the assessment about what comes next. Okay. The problem with risk assessments is we can't always predict human behavior, right? So what we do know, however, darn it, I know, right, is that, so it can be a little tricky. So what we're trying to do is gather as much information as we can about this particular situation, but we've also found is one of the potential benefits that I hear over and over when I train law enforcement on this, is they found it is a great way to write their reports from IRAD, is if they are getting this information from IRAD and then they go to write their incident report that night and their probable cause, they are writing it from IRAD and they're actually just walking right through the report that they need. So that assessment was developed, we started training law enforcement, and then it kind of spread from law enforcement to prosecutors, and we'll talk about how it's kind of used in some jurisdictions. And then advocates started using it to try to help assess safety. And then it kind of died off a little bit because, again, what happened is funding ran out, and so trainings stopped. And in particular, we had contracted with 2 law enforcement officers through the coalition who were doing trainings across the state. Well, they also had full-time jobs, so they couldn't also, work and travel all the time.
As do Jennifer and I.
Yeah, yes, exactly. And then Lisa and I would also train on, but cops listen to cops better. It's just it's a thing that they have. And then when I started at the coalition, I'm also a law enforcement trainer, and so I kind of took IRAD under my wing and started training on IRAD again without the need for a consultant. And then we've seen this second wave of interest in IRAD because of the domestic violence courts that have happened across the state. So in some of the domestic violence courts, the judges are asking for IRAD to be present in the case file, and so if the judge is asking for it, it better be in the file, right? Which means it's trickling back to the prosecutor, which means it's trickling back to law enforcement, who are then implementing it in their jurisdiction.
And that's really that was our goal, right? Yeah. When we created IRAD, our goal was to provide a rolling risk assessment, so that an officer does it on the scene, it assesses a risk of increasing dangerousness or markers for lethality. That then goes with the police report, which goes to the prosecutor. The prosecutor sees it, the prosecutor takes that to court, submits it as evidence to court. The judge uses the level of risk to decide how much bail and what the conditions should be based on risk. And then as the case goes on, maybe a victim witness coordinator, maybe a community-based advocate does the assessment, the risk assessment again, because what we know is that domestic violence relationships are not static. They don't just stay the same, they are ever changing. So they do it again as the case processes to see if there's an increase or decrease in risk. And then they have that information. Then if the person's convicted, those 2 IRADs then can go to the PSI writer, who then can do, or the probation officer, who then can do another IRAD assessment, or can ask the community-based advocate to do another IRAD assessment. So you have this ongoing level of risk throughout the system's response to keep check on what's happening in that relationship. The other reason we did that is because our hope was that we could take IRAD and IRAD could then also move out of the criminal justice system and over to the medical system, who also is more likely to see victims of domestic violence, right? So that emergency room doctors and emergency room nurses, when they have a victim present and they're treating the victim and law enforcement shows up, an emergency room nurse could look at a law enforcement officer and say they have a score of 4 on IRAD. And that officer would know what the emergency room nurse was talking about. And now there's a shared language so that it isn't, oh, we were confused, I misunderstood. Everybody knows what IRAD is, everybody knows what a 4 is, or everybody knows, hey, they've got a lethality factor, and everybody knows what that means. And so now, across systems, across agencies, people have a consistent idea of what the risk level is in this relationship.
I think that one of the exciting things about IRAD, which is kind of, I always had this theory that you are an expert everywhere but in your own state. So I call it the 50-mile rule. So I am not an expert here in Boise, but if I would travel 50 miles into Washington, then I'm considered an expert. So what has happened with IRAD is I just actually, and we've had this happen, Lisa's going to go to the Southern Policing Institute and present on it. I just presented at a national conference because people are understanding that they want a rolling risk assessment like this, and also understanding that they need something for rural jurisdictions where the possession of a weapon, simply owning a firearm, doesn't escalate you to the very top of the risk level. It happens here. And so in other risk assessments, if you own or have access to a weapon, it automatically escalates you to the top of the risk level. And IRAD doesn't do that. So it's different. So we don't get false positives. Right.
So if you're in a jurisdiction or in a part of the country where you have a high percentage of gun ownership and you're using, for example, DA, the danger assessment, or ODARA, where owning or possessing a firearm puts you, as Jennifer said, the highest risk level, that would mean that 80% of the cases would have a false positive of somebody's going to get killed here. When we reviewed cases of domestic violence related homicide, it was not the ownership of a weapon, it was the movement of a weapon. Did it used to be kept in a gun safe and now it's kept next to the bed? Did it used to be out in the garage or out in the truck, but now it's sitting, as one case that you talk about, in the baby's crib, right? Because it's the movement of the weapon. The fact that I want instant access to that weapon. Not the fact that I own a weapon, but that I want instant access. And I want to send a message to you that that weapon's right here, handy dandy. So if you're going to get out of line, it's right here, right? So for other jurisdictions that have high percentages of gun ownership, those other risk assessments are going to give you a lot of false positives because you're going to jump to the top of the charts. With IRAD, it's the movement of the weapon that's an indicator, not the possession of a weapon.
And one of the things that has happened for us, as far as IRAD goes, is some of the federal grants that have been released, including the STOP grant, which is a grant that's put out by the Office of Violent. Anyway, you guys don't need to know this, but a couple of the federal grants that have been put out, so as a deliverable, they want you to be able to do this. And so this last wave of funding that just started in October, a lot of these agencies are needing to implement a risk assessment. And so they've Googled and found us, or they came to this presentation and heard about it. So literally, like, after these things, we have a list of like 7 or 8 states that want to start implementing this risk assessment just because they need to.
So here in Idaho, we have about 44% of the counties, 44% of the jurisdictions using IRAD in our own state, 44%.
But everybody else wants to use it.
But the state of Washington asked to use it. San Diego Family Justice Center started using it about 3 years ago. New Orleans. And then like 5 years ago, I got a call from the Southern Policing Institute that said, hey, that IRAD thing we heard about that you have, we've got 7 agencies who are coming here for training who want to know something about it. Can you send us stuff? So we sent the whole PowerPoint thing, right? Oh, this is some fluke. And then like 3 weeks ago, I got a call from SPI and they're like, yeah, our national conference, we need you there. Because we have like, I don't know, 600 law enforcement officers who want to learn about IRAD, all in the southern part of the United States. And we're like, awesome! But 44% of the counties in Idaho. So
we'll get there, hopefully.
So, and we're going to have to speed through because we're already looking at quarter to 8.
Basically what we did is, what happened was and what sparked this whole thing was Idaho normally has about 12 to 13 domestic violence related homicides a year. And then in 2007, we went from 12 to it was 22 that happened that year. There was this, we literally doubled, and it was this anomaly of like what's happening and why is this happening. So IRAD was kind of sparked out of that whole piece of things. So what happened is we took the national research, we took Idaho case law, we reviewed incidents that officers were going out on, and developed IRAD out of all of that. So there's national research, there's a lot of Dr. Bose's staff's research about what was happening with Idaho case law and Idaho specific cases, and then we developed IRAD out of that. So you guys have IRAD sitting on your, because if you, do you want to flip down through? I'm not going to go through these particular cases. Keep going. Oh, go back one. There we go. So I'm going to steal someone's because, do I actually have the actual assessment? We go one more, Lisa.
There we go.
Okay, I can see you from that one. So because this is PowerPoint never do, you guys actually have a copy of the assessment for you because I don't expect you to be able to read this. So this is the assessment that we use with law enforcement officers, and this is how it's all drawn out. I think when we revise IRAD next, I believe we will do away with these because nobody actually draws things anymore because they actually take pictures, even the really rural jurisdictions. But so you understand this, when we originally developed this, we actually had to make forms in triplicate because there were still police officers
Carbon copy.
or police agencies that were actually had forms in triplicate, like they had no computer access. There are still agencies here in Idaho that don't have 911. Let me repeat that. There are still agencies here in Idaho who do not have 911 systems, okay? So we're working with some really big disparities in law enforcement response, okay? So these are the factors. Factor 1 is a history of domestic violence. And so what happens is you're supposed to be able to go through this form and you check the boxes, okay? The key to understanding IRAD is the highest score you can have is 7. Repeat that to me. The highest score you can have is? 7. Okay, so I have law enforcement officers who tell me, well, that person had an IRAD score of 10. Now, math is not my best subject, but I'm pretty sure you can't get 10 out of 7. Okay, the highest you can get is 7, right? So you're not counting individual boxes underneath the factor. If you would have 5 check boxes under factor 1 and no other check boxes, how many factors do you have? 1. Oh, see, you guys are smarter than. Don't tell anybody that I said you were smarter than the cops.
Because we have cops in here, so.
Oh, darn it. Okay.
But
when I train for Ada County, I always say, oh, we'll teach the lowest denominator, Boise City. And when I train for Boise City, I say we're going to teach the lowest common denominator, which is Ada County. Okay. And
good, because you have Boise City in here, too.
Okay, good. See? All right. So Boise City and Ada County are both using this form. Who are my Boise City cops in here? Raise your hands. Okay, Boise, not to call you out, Boise City's looks different because they adapted the form, which we're going to talk to them about later because when we go to evaluate, they can't do that. But for now, they've adapted the form. Ada County, your form looks the same. Who's my Ada County guys? Anybody? Or women? Seriously?
Nope.
Okay. Any other law enforcement in here? Because I'm going to pick on you. Probation? You guys are just too scared to raise your hands now. Whatever. All right. So you're able to go through the form and you answer all these questions. So you're asking if there's a current civil protection order in place or a current criminal no contact order. Those are 2 different things in the state of Idaho. Okay. Law enforcement all the time gets them mixed up. Okay. They'll tell a victim, go down and get a criminal no contact order or go down and get a civil protection order, and they don't know the difference. Okay. Who can tell me the difference? Yes.
Criminal no contact orders are put into place with a criminal case.
Yes.
Civil protection orders, you can apply for them regardless of whether there's a criminal case pending or not.
Right.
There are many other differences.
Yes, but that's the main one, absolutely. So people will oftentimes say, oh, there's a current criminal no contact order in place, but there is no criminal case even open. They mean there's a civil protection order in place, okay? And don't get me started when they start talking about restraining orders, which are gotten through an attorney and really not worth a hill of beans, and people shouldn't even be recommending them in the first place. 2 different things, okay? If the no contact order or civil protection order was violated in this particular incident, you mark it. You talk about if there's been an escalation of violence. So one of my favorite officers that I train with, when we talk about escalation of violence, and because usually officers will tell me all these questions they want to talk about, and ask a victim if there's been an escalation. My favorite officer will say, I asked 2 questions. What's the incident that happened tonight, and what's the worst incident that's ever happened? If they both happen to be the same incident, we have a pretty big escalation, right? Okay, now obviously we can ask some other questions, but those are some of the things that you can get to talk about it. Does the victim report a future threat of harm? What does the victim think is going to happen? Now, obviously, we know that victims of domestic violence minimize their situation, but many times they are a very accurate reporter of what their fear of future harm is. In fact, more accurate than many times this assessment will be. Okay? If there's serious injury in a previous incident, if there's any type of stalking behaviors, is somebody covering stalking this year?
No.
You guys?
I got space and you're busy. I got no space.
Open slot tomorrow.
Well, ask her if she's available, because she's the only one who's training on it.
Oh, that breaks my heart just a little bit. Okay, that's my pet issue. That's what I train on nationally, so it kind of just like breaks my heart just a little bit. Okay.
Kelly will only let me take you so long.
I know. My other job enforces some things. Okay, as has the individual been forced to have sex? Okay, so this is my experience with IRAD. When I go out and teach on IRAD and I go to jurisdictions, it's my personal policy that I do off time, not paid, that I always do a ride along with the law enforcement before I teach with them. It's a great way to build reports, way for me to understand their policies and procedures. They get to like me. It's a great situation. So I was doing a ride along one time with law enforcement, and I was doing it after I did the training. So I'm riding with this guy, and we catch a domestic, because of course dispatch is throwing the domestics our way because they know I'm in the car. So we catch a domestic and we go out, and this officer is so pumped to show me that he knows what's going on with IRAD. So we get out on the scene and he's administering IRAD, and this is what happens. And he's a great officer. I've worked with him before. But the victim's sitting there and he's standing like this, first of all, which if I'm an officer and I'm standing and you're the victim, what's right in my line of view? Your gun, right? And every single officer, just watch them. They all stand like this, okay? Which if you're a victim, you don't know that's how they stand. And so their hand is literally sitting on their gun. Okay, so now we have somebody holding the gun right in your face and asking you questions like, has there been a recent escalation of violence? Has there been any unwanted physical contact? Has he ever raped you? Has there been any previous Now, what did my victim do when the officer had said, has he ever raped you? What did she do? Like, her eyes got this big, and she goes, and he went on to the next question. Do we think she answered honestly? Okay, can we talk about rapport building a little bit before we go through IRAD, right? Okay. He, in attempts to get the information, was trying to get the information the best way he knew how. Those officers who've worked with IRAD enough can ask a lot of these questions just in a conversation base. Previous attempts of strangulation, if they've threatened abuse or if there's any allegation of abuse of animals, that's a check mark. So why do we have this all of a sudden red, italicized, bold font? Yours isn't red because we're cheap and we didn't make color copies. Yes, those are the lethality factors. Good job. We didn't just have sudden font anxiety. Okay, those are your lethality factors. Okay, so anything that's red and italicized and bolded on your sheet is a lethality factor. What the victim's perception of the risk is, this is where we're asking about weapons. Notice access to weapons, prior use of a weapon, weapons moved. I've actually had law enforcement tell me, I didn't ask those questions because he's a felon. Because felons never own weapons, right? They're like, you know what, I'm just done. I'm such a great felon. I'm going to automatically. Just like the same people who say, why don't we make these behaviors illegal? Yes, because if we make them illegal, people stop doing them. That's an excellent idea. Attempted strangulation. So why down here do we have attempted strangulation in red, italics, and up here we have previous attempts of strangulation, not in red and not italicized? Because we're trying to confuse you?
One shows an increase in lethality as opposed to a pattern.
Why? Why is that showing an increase in lethality? You're on the right track. Keep going.
I don't know.
No fair if you've had the class before.
That's the current and one's past.
One's current, one's past. So a risk assessment is the level of risk of dangerousness right now, right? So if there is attempted strangulation tonight, the victim's at risk of lethality. If there was previous attempts of strangulation, that's a risk factor, but it's not a lethality factor. Does that make
For right
sense?
now.
For right now. Okay, doesn't mean that somebody who isn't continuously strangled isn't at risk of eventually being killed by their partner, because that's a whole different training. Okay, and then we're talking about the differences that might happen as a result of strangulation. One of the questions that I train my officers when I talk about strangulation is, when you're doing this interview, get the victim a glass of water. So as you're doing the interview, when the victim's taking a drink of water, many times after a victim's been strangled, they'll do this when they take a drink. Even if they don't have any other signs or symptoms, it's difficult for them to swallow. If their voice is hoarse, I'll have officers who tell me, well, I thought that's what her voice always sounded like. Call her voicemail. Is it the same on her voicemail as the conversation that you're having with her right now? The other question that I instruct officers to ask is, instead of asking, have you been strangled or have you been choked tonight? Because victims' perception of what being strangled is like, and I pick on my own students. So if I wrap my hands around her neck, that's being strangled, because that's what we all see on the movies, right? But if I just do this, that's not being strangled. Or if I pin her to the ground and I put my knee in her chest, which I'm not going to demonstrate, okay, because there is a line. Okay, if I do that, then victims don't understand that as strangling. Okay, but it is, because you're cutting off somebody's airway or cutting off their blood flow. So if they ask a victim, at any point in time tonight, did you have difficulty breathing? That's an excellent question, because they may say, oh yeah, well earlier when he had the pillow over my face, or when he had his knee into my chest, and there's no visible injury, and it doesn't register in their brain as something that they want to be able to talk about, okay? So you ask all these factors up here, all right? The second factor is threats to kill. What's the difference between I'm gonna kill you and I'm gonna shoot you with a 9mm and then I'm gonna bury you 50 feet under the ground behind grandma's shed? Specific, right? So notice that this says a specific threat to kill victim. I have never worked with a single victim of domestic violence whose partner had not threatened that they were going to kill them. That's a common everyday occurrence. Okay, I'm going to kill you. I'm going to kill you. You leave me, I'm going to kill you. Okay, the difference is how specific the threat is. So just like people who are trained on suicide know that the more specific the threat is, the more increased risk of danger, same with this, okay? Specific threats to kill the children and displaying the weapon at the time of a threat. So I was doing a law enforcement training over in Rexburg a couple of years ago, and I don't usually say the town, oops, in Rexburg a couple of years ago, and I get to the hotel because I had driven all the way across the state and I was tired and uncomfortable, and so I switched into my swimming suit and I forgot my cover-up, so I pull on my Idaho Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence hoodie and zip it up and go down to get in the hot tub, and this creeper comes along and is following me into the hot tub area, and it's just him and I, and it's like 4:30 in the afternoon, and he says, hey, you work there? He points to my hoodie. Now the right answer was, no, I got this at a thrift shop, okay? Yep, but I'm blonde, and I say, yes. And he goes, oh. So by this time we are now in the pool, I've taken the hoodie off, I'm in the hot tub. He also gets in the hot tub next to me, and he's sitting next to me, he says, so what are you doing here? I'm here doing law enforcement training. He goes, well, that's good. And then I'm thinking, see, Jennifer, like, you're so damn judgmental. You're automatically putting him into a box, and you think he's a jerk, and like this guy is like saying this is a good thing that you're here training law enforcement. And he goes, because those motherfuckers are the reason that I live in this hotel. Inching towards the steps in the hot tub. And I was like, really? And he said, yep, because 3 weeks ago, I get in a fight with my old lady, and I'm sitting at the table, and I'm cleaning my rifle, and all of a sudden they say that I was like threatening her with my gun, and you know, you've probably fought with your old man too while he was cleaning his rifle, and I'm like, mm-hmm. And so they said I was threatening her with a rifle during the incident, and then they kicked me out of my house, and those fuckers are the reason that I'm living in this hotel. I was like, yeah, God, they're total jerks. See you later. Zip up my hoodie and run out. Okay, so the next day when I'm training law enforcement, I got a little bit more of the story. And obviously he wasn't just cleaning his rifle while he was sitting at the table. He was actually pointing it at her head while he was threatening her after they got into an argument. Again, go back to the book that's in the jail that he probably had about what he needed to say. Okay, so many times, obviously it doesn't have to be a firearm, it can be other things, but many times perpetrators will, and especially around here, the I'm cleaning my weapon thing gets brought up a lot. okay? If the suspect is suicidal, the number of attempts and the date of the most recent one, if they're depressed or have any other type of mental illness. Now, okay, every single time, everybody's going to want to say the perpetrator's crazy. Okay, this is a history of mental illness, documented history of mental illness, not just whether the victim thinks he's crazy or you think he's crazy. Okay, because perpetrators aren't crazy. FYI. So then separation, if there's been a recent separation, if there's a recent or imminent court action or loss of employment, those all qualify. The coercive controlling behavior, threats and intimidation, destruction of property. If there's monitoring by the suspect, which again, if you had a stalking training, would cover this. But somebody is doing the technology thing, right?
Yes, on Thursday.
Isolating a victim and extreme possessiveness. So are you allowed to see your friends and family? That's a lethality factor.
Does he follow you? Do you have to account for all of your whereabouts at a point in time? Is he texting you consistently, asking you where you are, when you're coming home, who you're with?
Do you buy your cell phone?
Yeah.
Prior police contact, if there's been a civil protection or a criminal no contact order, or any other type of prior police contact. If this is a guy who has to be like drug out of the bar at 2 o'clock in the morning every Sunday, that's prior police contact, okay? And if there's been a violation. And then the last one is alcohol and drug use, which we know now doesn't cause domestic violence, right? So you fill this out. So if I have 5 check boxes here and 1 check box here, how many factors do I have? 2, right? So then you go to the very top where it says, how many factors do you have? 1 to 3, 4 to 5, 6 to 7. The coordinated response came up with, this is what you should do about it. So they recommended if you have 1 to 3 factors, you do your standard follow-up procedures. 4 to 5, somebody should follow up with the victim within 48 hours. That doesn't have to be necessarily the responding law enforcement officer. That can be a victim witness coordinator. However, they have it established. 6 to 7 is follow up within 36 hours, and any italicized factor, even if you only have 1 checkbox and that checkbox happens to be an italicized factor, that somebody should be following up with a victim within 24 hours.
That puts you at the top of the pile.
So what's happening is when law enforcement is going out and doing these, and they're putting in the file, when they give it to their sergeant, whoever has to sign off, then it's going in that domestic violence supplement, then it's going to the prosecutors. The prosecutors would ideally use it when they're setting up parameters, asking for bail, all those bond. The judge would be using it when they're doing sentencing, and then afterwards, probation and parole would be using it to assess their level of monitoring for the suspect, okay? That's how it's happening in some jurisdictions.
Weezer and Payette, oddly enough, were the first locations where judges started asking for IRAD. Before law enforcement was even doing it. The judges had been to a training, I think it was a summit, and Jennifer and I had trained a bunch of people, a lot of medical professionals and a lot of judges on IRAD, and the judge went back over to Weezer and was like, where's my IRAD? And the prosecutor was like, well, I don't have one. And he's like, well, I want an IRAD. I want an IRAD with every case. So then the prosecutor goes back to law enforcement and is like, where's my IRAD? And law enforcement's like, we didn't do an IRAD. Well, you need to do an IRAD because I have to give it to the judge because he's on me. And lo and behold, I mean, we went out there and then lo and behold, I mean, 3 months later, law enforcement was doing it in every case. Prosecutors had it, judges had it.
Yeah. And so in the domestic violence courts, all the courts but Ada County are using this one, and they're not using it because it's not evaluated. So even though it's evidence-based, we have not had the money to evaluate it. So we're hoping to write a grant and then get an evaluation done probably here through Boise State of it. And then once it's evaluated, then we're hoping people will switch over. But even Ada County now is starting to change their tune a little bit after some constant talking about what it is and how it's being implemented. But the problem with training on it is that a particular Ada County judge just said to me last week, he's like, well, this is the problem with it is I get 2 forms in the file and they have 2 different scores. So obviously people don't even know how to do it. So I had to say it's a rolling risk assessment. One was done when they were arrested, one was done by the prosecutor. You're supposed to have 2 different forms. That means they're doing it right, judge, not that they're doing it wrong. So obviously we still have some education to do.
All right.
Anything else you want to say on that?
No, you covered
done.
it perfectly.
Thanks.
Great job.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
All right.